Happy Saturday, everybody, and welcome back to our next lesson in A Tale of Two Kings. On Wednesday, we had just talked about how God had made a covenant with David about how even though David wanted to build a house for God's presence to dwell in, God had said basically, no, you're not going to do this, but your son is going to. And so already we see a lot of differences in how King Saul started out his kingship and how King David started his. Whereas King Saul started getting really impatient and didn't really want to wait on God. And here we have King David actually waiting and listening to what God has to say and really trying to do what God had asked him to do, which was not to build the temple. And so he doesn't. However, in our story today, it kind of takes a different sort of a turn because as we talked about on Wednesday, just because King David wanted to do what was right and do what was God's heart, it doesn't mean that he wasn't going to experience temptation. And so today we have a story about King David experiencing temptation.
Yeah, so David ends up sending what is his army and Joab, what is his major general, out to war against the people. But he stays behind in Jerusalem. And this is the time in which, kings would go off with their own armies in order to be able to, claim land, in order to be able to be successful in their campaigns. But this time, David stays behind. And so he actually wakes up very late one morning and he's, goes on to the roof of his own palace, and then he sees this woman bathing on some other roof. And so then he desires her, which was a problem, and David wasn't supposed to be there, but not only was it a problem because of where he was in the situation, but because this woman was actually the wife of one of his own soldiers. So now David doesn't care about any of this. He actually brings this woman, who is Bathsheba, to his own palace and, lays with her. And so this is a terrible situation because it was even forbidden in the law that they had at the time, and God had forbidden it, which just had terrible consequences because then Bathsheba actually gets pregnant because of this situation. So now David, scrambles to try to fix the situation. So this is what he does. He brings Uriah, which is the husband of Bathsheba, back from the war and says, okay, stay a moment with me. You're a great soldier and all of that. And tries to get him drunk and into this, this whole party for him, and sends him back with his wife, because the idea was then Uriah would sleep with his wife, and then no one would know that it was David's child. However, Uriah didn't want to indulge in all of this celebration when his own fellow men, his own peers, were off in a battle. It's like, why would I have this amazing chance to do all of this if my friends and all of that are all battling their lives out there? So he doesn't actually sleep with his wife. He doesn't even go into the house. This ends up still being a problem for David. So David then, what he does is he says to Joab, okay, put Uriah right in the front of where the battle is happening, and then pull back everybody else so that the other army would then kill Uriah, which ends up happening. And actually it ends up happening to a cost to the army, because Joab actually doing that whole retreating really made them lose in the battle. So when Joab sends a messenger back to David to say, we didn't do very well, but Uriah died, David was like, okay, we count our losses, and what the important thing was for David wasn't his own his own army or the success, was the fact that Uriah died. So now we're in this situation in which David has done terrible things. Not only did he sleep with someone else's wife, but even killed the husband because of what would happen in order to cover his own wrongdoings. So, obviously, God at the end of the story is furious and displeased.
And so, through all of this, it wasn't like God didn't know what had happened, but for a while it seems like God isn't going to deal with what David had done. And so, next time we talk, we'll talk about the consequences of what David's actions had brought, because as we find out, everything that we do, whether good or bad, they all have different consequences in our lives. And so if we make good choices, we can have good consequences. Like if we choose to study in school, we could get good grades and do better on tests. And if we choose not to study and do things like play video games, we may not end up doing so well in school. We may end up trouble with our teachers, with our parents. Maybe you get held back a grade. And so there's lots of consequences to our actions. David is no exception to this. And God doesn't deal with him directly in this story, but he's going to, and he is going to be harsh with David because his actions had consequences. And so as we continue on, we'll talk a little bit more about how this affects David, and then later how it affects the rest of his family, because David had other wives, he had other kids, and this ends up being a problem in his family. And so we'll talk about that more later, and we'll see you then.